Bruce is a pulmonologist and an immunologist. He's the principal investigator on an international COVID-19 early therapeutic intervention program, and we are going to ask Bruce about COVID-19. He's also got an Order of Australia for service to the community. He's the author of a number of books. He's a past Western Australian of the Year, and he's set up something called the Fathering Project, about good fathering, which is being rolled out across schools in Australia. And of course, last but not least, Bruce is a Christian and he's a fellow of ISCAST. Now, Bruce, we're going to start talking tonight about COVID-19. You're a bit of an expert on COVID-19, although you tell me that in the hospital they won't let you near the COVID-19 cases because you're a bit older, shall we say, and more at risk. Is that right?
Yeah, basically the head of our department. We've obviously, being a pulmonary department, we're at the front line, and we prepared for a total avalanche. We had daily meetings, and myself and another guy who's older, they said, look, you guys can see the regular cases. So we've got what we call a dirty team, the young doctors who see the COVID patients, because their risk if they get COVID isn't so great. And then the rest of us, including the two older ones, we see all the regular asthmatics and all the other viral pneumonias as well, but we just see them.
Yep. Well, let's talk a bit more about COVID-19. Tell us what you're doing. You're involved in the forefront of research into COVID-19. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we had an idea. So with regard to the treatment of COVID-19, and just forgetting vaccines for the moment, which no one thinks are going to be all that good, is the idea of finding some drugs that could work to restrain the disease. Mm-hmm. And there have been over 500 clinical trials. Nothing has worked, Chris.
Is that right?
And some of those, in fact, more than 100 have been hydroxychloroquine, and that's a whole saga. I mean, people are doing their best at a time when they didn't know what was going on. But we've got two strategies which are unique, and one of them is we think you should get in early. No one's been able to do this very well, or if at all, because patients are in strict home isolation, but you want to sort of put your finger in the dike early on, because by the time they get to hospital, the disease is quite advanced. So to do that, we've got a really advanced home monitoring, digital home monitoring system that the patients can get hooked up to. That gives us the freedom to do clinical trials early on. The second idea is to use machine learning, artificial intelligence, to look at COVID-19 and predict which drugs will work. And this is a fairly recent and quite a complicated process, deep learning, computational process. But we've linked up with London, the Imperial College, Benevolent AI, and with Stanford on this. And they've predicted, we've got two drugs already that have been predicted out of that system, one of which is already in clinical trial and is looking pretty good. That's in stage 2 patients, so we're going to be treating them in stage 1. So that combination of being able to get in early and to use drugs which are predicted by machine learning, therefore should work better rather than guessing, we hope will make a difference. I mean, the dream, just to finish, Chris, the dream is that we can repurpose 3 or 4 drugs that are widely available and make them available in poor countries for the inevitable tsunami of cases they're all already getting, so that people don't die, and really so that the society doesn't get locked down, because it's an economic catastrophe. You know, I would do a lot of work in Indonesia, and my goodness, they don't have a safety net work, the sort of work support that we have. So there's all sorts of challenges facing them, and we'd love to find a set of, say, 3 or 4 drugs you could take as soon as you got sick, and it would stop the disease progressing.
Mm-hmm. Bruce, obviously COVID-19 is terrible for some people and is causing fatalities and is causing deep suffering for some people. But on a scale, is the cure worse than the disease? I mean, in comparison, for example, with flu, I understand we have thousands of deaths from flu. We're making extraordinary efforts to deal with this. How do you balance that out? And the question that some people ask anyway is the cure worse than the disease? How do you respond to that?
Yeah, well, certainly the disease is pretty bad, and although we get seasonal flu and 1,000 people die in Australia every year, plus or minus, it's kind of a known. Whereas this thing is ripping through countries, and you know, a lot of people have died already. But you're right, and it is a discussion that we've been too frightened to have, because it's cost Australia, I think it was costing us $4 billion a week. And the Minister for Finance came on recently and said a second wave, which could hit Australia next year, would cost us $80 billion. Who's going to pay for that? And it's the young people who won't have jobs. So it is a discussion. The price we are paying to control this disease will be paid by the young people who are going to be looking for jobs when they finish their studies, their TAFE courses, etc. There won't be those jobs. And that's a form of suffering in itself, you know, that if, you know, to be unable to get a job is, you know, it's, I mean, I'm lucky. I'm in a profession that is always needed. GFC, COVID-19, whatever happens, people get sick, but people don't always need, you know, all sorts of professions.
So what does the future look like? We hear about all the talk about a vaccine, but if you read between the lines, vaccines are pretty unusual for this sort of thing, aren't they? Are we going to find a vaccine?
We could do, and I hope we do, and we got some good people working on it. But the truth of the matter is that we haven't got even a vaccine for the common cold, and even the one for influenza, which we all have, well, most of us have, doesn't work that well. It works in at-risk people. So what has been said is that it might work, it probably won't, or it might work a little bit. But whatever the case is, we need a plan B. So our project is plan B, that you might find some drugs that can put the finger in the dike and stop it flooding, turn it into a mild flu. So it's important to be realistic about whether a vaccine is going to work or not. If you assume it's going to work, then you don't work on a plan B. Yep. Bad idea. You know, you got to have contingencies, and so we're working hard to make sure that we've got that plan B available, or at least we're going to try.
What about the bigger picture? This has obviously been catastrophic to the world economy, and for many, many people, catastrophic in a very personal, existential way. Is this the way of the future? Are we going to see more of this sort of thing? Just this week, we heard about another possible swine flu being passed on to humans. Are we going to learn to live in regular biennial lockdowns or something like that?
Well, I think there's all sorts of reasons why that could be the case. And one of them is that as the human population expands, our engagement with animals is much closer. And of course, we travel a lot. So the viruses can rip around the world, as we've seen. So for all sorts of reasons, pandemics, and some of them quite frightening. I mean, you know, bird flu is a pretty frightening disease, for example, worse than COVID-19. So we have to be ready for pandemics. And to be honest, not to beat our own drum here, but one of the strategies that we've got with our project is that if you find drugs that can turn off certain mechanisms in the body that are caused by COVID-19, probably those same mechanisms will be caused by the next virus and the next virus. So we think that whatever we find might be suitable for those viruses as well. But Chris, it's not just viruses. I mean, one of the things about global warming is we are going to, you know, bushfire. We've had a terrible bushfire season. Bushfires and cyclones and things are going to increase. That is scientifically inevitable because of the way the ocean heats up and what have you. So the world will be a world where disasters and catastrophes increase into the future.
Yeah. And that brings us on to, if you like, the next stage of our talk. Let's talk a little bit about suffering. You're pretty familiar with suffering, at least you're certainly familiar with the suffering that comes from having to bring bad news to patients, cancer bad news, other sorts of breaking bad news. So you do it fairly regularly. Do you get used to that?
Yeah, so just to explain to people who are watching, so as a lung specialist, the commonest lethal cancer is lung cancer. And they get lots of other cancers happen in the lung as well, asbestos cancers and what have you. So they often come to me first, have their tests, and they come for the results, and I have to tell them basically they're going to die. I've done that hundreds and hundreds of times. And my strategy isn't to then handball them off to the oncologist or the radiotherapist. I do the journey. I mean, as a Christian wanting to show the compassion of Jesus, I do the journey with them until they die. I've been doing that for, I don't know how many years, 30 years probably. Do I get used to it? Yes and no. I often get teary myself. Actually, to be honest, Chris, I consider it a privilege and an honor to be in that situation. And sometimes the patients say to me, "Hey, Bruce, this is hard for us, but it must be hard for you. You got to do it all the time." I say, "Yeah, it can get hard, particularly the young ones." But I say, look, it's an honor and a privilege to be in. I mean, it's the most intimate moment a doctor can have with their patient. A doctor says, "I'm really sorry, but the news is, you got cancer and you're going to die." We don't say it as brutally as that, but it is hard, but it is also a privilege.
Now, you've written a book about that, haven't you? The book is called Surviving and Growing from Suffering, including strategies for those people who are suffering, and including, I think, some Bibles, some Christian input. I'm not sure because I haven't read the book. Tell us about the book.
Yeah, it's actually written for Christians. Yeah, I mean, I'm no particular expert on the theology of suffering. I've thought about it a lot, of course, and I get asked about it by my Christian patients who sit in my office and they're going to die. How can God allow this to happen? I've got teenagers and that sort of thing. And I have been asked to talk about it in various groups, outreach and other sorts of groups. And for some reason, people feel that my experience with suffering gives it an authenticity or an imprimatur to speak about it. So not just the cancer patients, but that's a deeply personal story for a lot of people. But also, of course, I've worked at the coalface of human innocent suffering. So I've worked up in, for example, I made 5 trips up to Aceh after the tsunami there. It's killed 250,000 people, and Haiti and Padang earthquake, and most recently, South Sulawesi, with the earthquake and tsunami there. It's a place where the villages collapsed under the mud. Seen the most awful suffering of human beings, and they're innocent human beings. Anyway, and I think, just to summarize, I won't, we can talk about the book if you like, but the reason I think that people feel they want to listen to me talk isn't that I've got anything different to say than the great theologians. I don't. It's just that it proves one thing. When people like Richard Dawkins say anyone who's seen suffering, bad suffering, could never believe in God, the fact that I've seen it in spades at the coalface, more than probably anybody, or not anybody, but a lot, and I'm still a strong Christian, means it cannot be a knockdown argument. It's the same with my science. The fact that I'm a card-carrying scientist, again, Richard Dawkins says no scientist really believes in God. I mean, it's not true. So my book is, well, that's the reason I did it. The book is not about a theological or philosophical discussion of suffering. It's exactly what you said, surviving and growing from suffering, because I've noticed people just don't know what to do. They're lost. And I'm talking about family members and friends, and I've seen it hundreds of times. So this is, how do you survive suffering? And then how do you grow from it? Anyway, that's basically what it's about.
Some people do manage to survive, and their faith manages to survive, but other people, whether Christians or not, other people suffering can make you pretty cheesed off about life, can't it? How do you help the person who's finding themselves in an ongoing sort of state of bitterness about how the world is? or even more generally speaking, young people who look at the world today. They may not have experienced personal existential suffering, but they look at the world that we're in and they look at the future and they do lack hope. The theme of our conference is a hopeful future, ? How do you help those people?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and I negotiate that quite a bit. I can tell you how you don't help them, and I'm sure anyone listening would know this, but I'm going to say it anyway. You don't help them by answering the question that they put to you. There's always a person behind the question. And so my experience is that it doesn't help, even if you've got the right answer, the world's best theological or philosophical answer, not only does it not help, to be honest, it can be hurtful. So my strategy, to be honest, is from straight out of the Bible: weep with those who weep. Be moved with compassion for people and try to understand the heart behind the question. So if a young person says, "Oh, I don't believe in God because God's allowed suffering," there's something they've experienced or seen, something that's triggered that feeling. And to be honest, I watch guys like Christopher Hitchens in the New Atheists, the late Christopher Hitchens. And he would go on and on in debates about there can't be a God, and he would talk about, go from one form of suffering to another, trying to make people bleed. And I look at him and I think, there's some reason why you... No, let me just finish this answer by telling a Christopher Hitchens story.
Tell us a story.
In his book, I think it's called Hitch 22. Anyway, it's Christopher Hitchens' life story. So he's like the Billy Graham of atheism. His mother died. His mother left his father, went off with some poet, and in Athens, she took her own life. She committed suicide in a suicide pact with her lover. She actually tried to call him as she was dying in bed with an overdose. Anyway, he flew to Athens and he had to sort of deal with it. It was pretty horrible. And he contacted the local Protestant priest because he wanted her to get buried in the Protestant ceremony. And he said, we can't do that because she was living in sin, and we can't do that because she took her own life. And I just about melted down with rage because I know that Jesus would have said, mate, you would have wept with him, taken him down the road for a pizza, had a beer with him or a glass of wine, and just wept with him and asked him about his mother. That's exactly what Jesus would have done. We know that because he was moved with compassion for people. And when Christopher Hitchens goes on and in his debates, I feel empathic for him. He's been hurt. That's not the only reason, I'm sure. So how do I respond to them? I weep with those who weep.
Yeah.
There's lots of answers. We can go into that if you want. And the books, what I deliberately did was stuck all those things at the back of the book. The Buddhist answer, the Hindu answer, the atheist answer, why the Christian answer is clear, and the different ways that Christians look at it. But I deliberately stuck it at the back of the book, and I focused on how you can respond. And maybe I should just mention this too. I have a thing called the 2-minute warning. This is the 2-minute warning. You're in church and there's a 2-minute warning, like in a basketball match, boom, 2 minutes to go, or a football match. Now we're going to sing our last hymn. So this happened to me because my wife had breast cancer, and 2 minutes to go, I went out the door and went home, and I would always run into my friend Michael, a lawyer from down the road. His daughter had a leukemia type disease, and he was leaving at the same time. Why? Because we didn't want to have to face everyone because they didn't know what to say. They did not know what to say, and in not knowing what to say, they often made it worse. So a lot of the book is about what you can do as a Christian when someone doesn't have to be in church, but let's say it's in church or at work or one of the other mums or dads at school or whatever is suffering. How can you be moved with compassion and be like Jesus to them, rather than saying something stupid or hurtful or avoiding them because you don't know what to say? That's pretty much why I wrote the book.
Let me finish with one more question. And before I ask this question, let me tell the people that are listening to us, that are watching us, now is the time, if you've got a question for Bruce, now is the time to type your question into the chat window on YouTube, and we'll pick up that question and we'll ask Bruce your questions. Bruce, I guess my question has to do with the future. It has to do with the theme of our conference, COSAC. Our theme is a hopeful future. Questions about creation, the climate, the environment, but also questions about artificial intelligence, gene editing. There are a lot of questions that raise anxiety. The word eco-anxiety is a new word in our vocabulary. What do you say to young people, or what might you say to young people who look at the 21st century and say, well, the future really doesn't look too good? They might be Christian people, they might not be Christian people, and perhaps you've got an answer for both, but who look at the 21st century and say things really don't look very rosy, and there isn't a lot of reason, there isn't a lot of reason to live, some would say, or to hang in there. What would you say?
Again, it's a great question, Chris, honestly. And obviously I've got kids, so, you know, I'm aware of all those things. But firstly, pessimism, that sense of foreboding and pessimism is not new to this generation. Indeed, none of those things you mentioned, I would argue, ought to induce that much pessimism. For example, when I was a kid, it was a nuclear holocaust. You know,
I remember it well.
The nuclear holocaust, and there's no doubt it would have wiped out, you know, nuclear winter probably would have wiped us all out. And prior to that, there were, you know, all sorts of world wars, and then there were the bubonic plague and all sorts of things. I think fear and grief have been part of the human experience since we walked upright. You think about fear and grief and suffering, you know, in fact, we are safer today than ever. And, you know, until the last generation or so, half your kids would die. I can't think of anything worse in my life than one of my children dying, but half the kids would die. And then your husband would go off to war, or he'd go off in a ship and the ship would sink and you wouldn't know, just he wouldn't come back a year later or whatever. On and on it goes. Suffering is, and there was no antibiotics, and you die of appendicitis or scarlet fever or diphtheria. But again, I would be very careful with, I mean, that's the fact, but I'd be very careful with that answer, because again, do more harm than good. I find it better to ask, what do you mean and what do you think? Just finishing with the Christian point of view, I do think the Bible is very clear about these things. There's a few things. Number one is we are promised that we are indestructible. It's a great promise, I think, that, you know, we're not at the whim of somebody, you know, we're indestructible, but that God loves us on this whole journey. It is the valley of the shadow of death. There's a cartoon in my book, and it's got a highway sign, and it says, Valley of the Shadow of Death, straight ahead. You know, one of those green, white arrows in it. Yep. And then it's got detour to avoid, and the detour is blocked off. And the question is, why didn't God say, Valley of the Shadow of Death, mate, just go left, go right, you can avoid it. It just happens to be part of life, everybody. But the point about the Bible is that he will be with you on that journey, and you will dine with him at the end, either in this life, having grown and be transformed by suffering, which is everybody that suffers has that opportunity. You know, in secular society, they say, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That's not true. What doesn't kill you, and I've seen this so often, can make you stronger, or, as you alluded to, can make you bitter. And we have a phrase in our cancer work that goes like this about grief. Grief can make you bitter, or it can make you better. It's all about how you respond to it. And Christians have a clear roadmap of surviving and growing from suffering. And it's one of those incredibly annoying things about Christianity. That is that you grow more from suffering than you do from just living a comfortable life. You grow as a person, you grow in awareness, you grow in compassion, you grow in your relationship with God, more through suffering than through anything else. I mean, it is annoying. When I was young, I heard this and I thought, oh, gee, wouldn't it be great if you could just go straight down the highway and avoid all this? But it's just not so. So when I talk to young people, I say, you know, as someone who's been on the journey and has seen a lot of it, there is the valley of shadow of death, but God will walk with you and you will experience a closeness to God that you wouldn't otherwise in your comfort zone. And you will grow and be transformed and you'll be better for it. And you will dine in riches on this earth, let alone in the next life.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're getting some feedback from people. One person, Shelley, says, thank you, Bruce, for your compassionate approach. I love going back to thinking, what would Jesus' response be? So thank you for that one. We have another question, which is a very practical question, one you'll like, actually. Where can we find Bruce's book?
Well, to be honest, it's still going through the editing publishing process. So the book's been completed, and I haven't had time to give it any attention since COVID-19 hit, and I've got an editor looking at it and various things. So it'll hopefully come out end of the year or something like that. There was some discussion about bringing it out during COVID, but it's all too fast. So, but thank you for, I might sell one copy there. Mind you, Chris, when I wrote my first book on fathering, I just felt moved to write it, and I honestly thought 12 people would buy it. Anyway, it turned into a bestseller, and no one was more surprised than me, but it did show that people out there had an urgent sense that they didn't know what to do as dads. And that's, of course, turned into the Fathering Project, which is now being rolled out across all the schools in the country. No thanks to me, thanks to the wonderful team, but I honestly thought 12 people would buy the book, so at least I got one person who's going to buy the book.
Well, as an ISCAST fellow, I think we could say that we'll be happy to put the book on our website, the details of where it can be bought, and some book reviews or some excerpts or something like that. So make sure you let us know as soon as you have things to put on the website there. We've got another question from Terry. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, just to remind, it's a practical book. It's what makes it different, other than my own experience and quotes of those experiences. It's a practical book, you know, surviving and growing. It's not why does God allow suffering? It's about surviving and growing. So I think for people who want to learn what to do for themselves or a loved one, or how to behave at church or at school when someone's dying or sick or divorced and, you know, falling apart or whatever, it's practical. How to be like Jesus in those situations.
Great. And you said it's specifically written for Christians or aimed at Christians, but for everyone? It
is aimed at Christians, but the way it's written, because it's not an argumentative book, I think anyone who reads it will get a sense of what the love of Jesus is like.
Okay. Terry has a question. He asks, why has, quote, the science been so politicized? I assume he's talking about the way people are using, in one way or another, the science of COVID-19. Why has it become such a politicized issue? And I guess we could extend that to the way the science of climate change is also a very politicized issue.
Yeah, I'm not surprised, because my observation, one of the things about getting old is, of course, you've seen this dozens of times. Anything becomes a political issue if it suits your purpose. Anything, you know, anything becomes a political issue. And, you know, we've often talked about the notion of the knife. A knife is just a knife, and it can be something that kills people if they stab them to death, or what a surgeon would use a knife to save people's life. It's not the knife that's the problem, it's what people do with it. And, you know, these things are just knives, really. So you know, anything in life is used by people to achieve their things they're passionate about. And so I'm sure, even as a scientist, I'm passionate about certain things. So I don't think I use them particularly, but I may do that. I may do that, but you know, I just think it's the way human beings are, to use whatever tool they can to express their passion, their disappointment, their emotions, whatever they are.
Mm, mm, mm. Well, I think we might call it quits here. Thank you very much, Bruce, for joining us from Perth. It's about 6 o'clock over there, about tea time or something like that. What's the weather like in Perth?
And not bad today, but it's been had a great early winter. It was 23, 24 degrees, but it's been freezing cold lately. So I'm looking forward to, I don't do winter very well. I'm a real Australian rules football buff. I've played it and coached it, and I'm actually patron of one of the Western Australian clubs. So I'm a bit of a football junkie. And I think that's always carried me through the winter when I was younger. But now as I get older, I just want to do the grey nomad thing and head north and get some sun. Even in Perth, which has a pretty mild winter.
You told me before we started the interview, you told me that you are heading north in the coming week or so for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks. I'm not sure what, and some of your family are going to join you up there at Exmouth. So we wish you well. We hope it's a good time. Now, let me just remind our listeners and our viewers that this is the first of the sessions for COSAC 2020. COSAC stands for the Conference on Science and Christianity, which ISCAST has run every couple of years for the last 30 years or so. Please do sign up for COSAC. We have roughly 50 speakers, and if you sign up for COSAC, you will be able to hear all of them, not all at the same time. But not all at the same time over the weekend, next weekend. COSAC is running between July 10 and July 12. But after that, you will have an opportunity to listen to the recordings of all of those speakers. You can sign up on our website, and we look forward to seeing you at COSAC. And thank you once again, Bruce. We'll leave you now, and thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks, Chris. See you.